So no matter what season, you're always going to experience the potential for cold nights. And so I want to go over some little tricks that I use when it comes to sleeping warm. There's some kind of key do's and do nots, especially when we're dealing with sleeping bags, to make sure that you're comfortable out there and that you can actually spend the night and get some rest, most importantly. The first thing that you want to look at is what you're wearing. So there's some key items that you actually don't want to wear when you're in your sleeping bag. I'm going to start from the kind of the bottom and work my way up. The very first thing you want to do is change your socks. Even if you feel like your socks aren't that wet, I assure you that they are. So you always want to put on a dry pair of socks before you crawl into your sleeping bag. And I actually keep a dry pair of socks just right in the bottom of my sleeping bag. And these just live in the bottom of my sleeping bag for an entire trip. When I get into my tent, I take off my wet socks, I pull out my sacred socks out of the bottom of my sleeping bag, and I slip those on. And when I wake up in the morning, the first thing that I do, or one of the first things that I do, is I take off those sacred socks, I leave them in the sleeping bag, and I put on either the socks that I was wearing the day before, or maybe I might have an extra pair of socks depending on the length of the trip. So that's number one, dry socks. The next thing that you're going to think about, or that you want to think about, is your base layer. So base layer being things like a merino wool layer or some sort of a polypro type of layer, essentially long johns, if you will. So you're going to want to put that on. And just like any outdoor layer, we're avoiding cotton here. So put on that. You've got your base layer, your upper base layer, and your bottom base layer. You're going to want to have that on. Now, sometimes what people think to do is they start to put on more layers when they get cold. And that can actually affect you negatively. What can happen when we're dealing with this sleeping bag is, how a sleeping bag works is the down, or if it's a synthetic sleeping bag, is going to puff up and provide lots of loft in that sleeping bag. And when you start filling that sleeping bag with lots of items, you end up making the loft less so, and it gets a little bit thinner on your sleeping bag. And so if you're going to stuff tons and tons of clothes either around you or on you into that sleeping bag, you're actually going to hinder that sleeping bag from being able to do the work that it truly needs to do. So try to avoid too many layers. So there's one layer in particular that we want to avoid inside the sleeping bag, and that is waterproof or windproof layers. These layers actually do a really good job of keeping us warm. And when we're out of the sleeping bag, when we're just out in the mountains or out in the wilderness, our body heat goes through our base layer into our midweight if we're wearing one, and then gets trapped by this waterproof, windproof layer. And when we're out and about, that's great. But when we're inside of our sleeping bag, if all the hot air is being trapped inside of our waterproof jacket, then we're not getting any hot air, warm air going into our sleeping bag. And how the sleeping bag works is that loftiness of the sleeping bag actually warms up and traps that warm air, keeping you nice and warm. And because we're in some sort of a shelter or some sort of a tent, we don't lose that hot air through convection or through wind because we're protected by our tent or our shelter. So by having these waterproof layers on, you prevent the sleeping bag from actually working really well. Now what you can do, and I've talked about this in a previous video about managing moisture in a tent, you can take those waterproof layers and shove them underneath of your air mattress or your thermarest. And that's going to do a couple things. A, if they're wet, they're not going to get the tent and your sleeping bag wet. But the other thing that it's going to do is it's going to create one extra layer of insulation between you and the ground. And that's a really important thing to consider when we talk about staying warm. The air mattress or the thermarest is a really important piece to this as well. But I'll save that for another video. So on particularly cold nights, especially when I'm winter camping, one thing that I'll actually do is take a hot water bottle. So one of those hard-sided Nalgene bottles, I'll fill it with boiling water, and I actually chuck that down into the bottom of my sleeping bag, and I warm up my sleeping bag. The other thing that I'll do too, if I have my sacred socks kind of hanging out there, my sacred socks will get a little bit toasty warm as well with that hot water bottle. So that's the first thing that I'm going to do on really, really cold nights. Then once I'm in my layer that I need to be in, I'll crawl into my sleeping bag and I'll get zipped up. So on particularly cold nights, I'm going to want to have this sleeping bag zipped all the way up and around my head. And I'm going to use the hood of the sleeping bag to stay nice and warm. I'm going to keep my arms inside of my sleeping bag as well. And if I need to, I can zip or cinch up these straps and get this really tight around my head. And I will even go as far as to have on some nights, the only thing showing is my nose and my mouth. I never want to breathe inside of my sleeping bag because then I'm going to get moisture or air in there. So depending on how cold, I'm going to go on kind of different extremes of this method. Now, if cinching that sleeping bag isn't enough to keep you warm, the one last resort that I do is actually creating a better neck gasket using a puffy layer. So instead of taking a puffy like this synthetic puffy or a down puffy and putting it on as if I'm wearing it, I actually take it and I wrap it around my head. Now the other thing you can do too is add a toque into the mix. So you've almost got toque and a scarf like this. You can then cinch that sleeping bag around your face to try to keep warm. Now, if I happen to wake up cold in the middle of the night and I've tried all of those steps and I'm still cold, there's a couple things that I'm gonna do. Number one, if you have to go to the bathroom, go to the bathroom. Our body actually works really hard for some silly reason to keep our urine warm. And so if you have to go pee, I know the last thing you want to do is leave your sleeping bag and go outside, especially winter camping. But anytime that I'm backpacking, anytime that I have to go pee in the middle of the night, I'm always having this internal debate of like, I don't want to get out of my sleeping bag, it's going to be cold. But if you go pee, your body no longer has to keep that pee warm, and you will actually be a lot warmer getting into your sleeping bag. So number one, go pee if you have to. Second one, do a little bit of sleeping bag calisthenics. So what I mean by that is sometimes what I'll do is I'll bench press on the inside of my sleeping bag and actually do little exercises inside of my sleeping bag. I've also gone as far as to take my base layer off and put it back on again. And just that simple motion inside your sleeping bag will actually get you a lot warmer at that point. And then worst case, if it really comes down to it, you've got a tent buddy, see if they've got an extra layer, see if there's something that they can help you out with as well. And then moving on from there, if you really need to, you could always perhaps take your water bottle, go back to the kitchen, boil some water, heat it up, bring that hot water bottle back into your sleeping bag as a last resort. Figure out what works for you. If you've got any suggestions, any tips, you can comment below. And if you haven't done so already, make sure you subscribe and like this video.